The most sustained clash in the culture war has been over the transitioning of children. Parents and allies of trans youth are driven by what they see as essential to every child's health and wellness, that they be accepted and loved for who they are. Their deepest instincts are for the welfare of the children. Opponents deplore the practice as unethical, will frame it in graphic bodily terms, and maintain that parents who support their transgender kids are succumbing to a social contagion and are selfish Svengalis and perpetrators of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Their deepest instincts are for the welfare of the children. Trans-activism progressed very visibly and very rapidly. In recent times, we've seen something of a correction, and the surprising thing is the extent to which it is driven not just by a conservative backlash, but by the work of process-driven old media, legal, and medical institutions. The public has begun to look beyond a general solidarity to parsing trans rights into various categories: athletics, private spaces, ethics around ages of transition, and the social media, peer and socio-cultural influences, mental health, and relativist changes to concepts of gender and sexuality. In order to make sense of it all, we have to distinguish between two slightly different things: trans people and trans ideology. Activism thrives when lived, marginalized experience is imbued with academic abstractions of identity politics. However, when in-depth media investigations and inquiries led by professionals with unquestioned integrity eventually catch up to the activism, it will, as we are witnessing with trans ideology, find itself pinced between an acerbic online backlash and subdued, scrupulous institutionalism. It's difficult to fend off reactionary trolls and empiricist peers with OBE and FRCN after their surname at the same time. To get a proper sense of the issue, we need to go back to June 26, 2015. After the US Supreme Court's Obergefell decision making gay marriage legal at the federal level, it seemed like the trans community's empowered integration would be a kind of minor addendum, that trans people would benefit from many of the national recognitions and protections. We would be largely done with the culture wars over sexual identity and rights, and that would more or less be that. Popular culture produced a string of highly polished, sensitive depictions of redoubtable and sympathetic trans youth. The Australian drama First Day, the UK drama Butterfly. Tolerance and recognition of trans youth were prerequisite to decent society, to the hierarchies and milieus of the entertainment and media industries. All multi-generational movements of social liberation will inevitably have their flakier and more strident elements. That is part and parcel of such narratives, which span eras, class, regionality, factions, and waves. Feminism had Seneca Falls and the suffragettes, but the second, third, fourth, and fifth waves of feminism would turf up their fair share of contentious writers, ideologues, and even militants. The civil rights movement, raised to lofty idealism and passive resistance, and abiding through Pettus Bridge and Dr. King's martyrdom, would inevitably, given its scale, spawn minor but more radical offshoots. LGBT rights went through a radical phase among the fringe in the 80s of outing gay people against their will, and more recent heel-digging over wedding cakes being produced by businesses who had moral or religious qualms. But for the most part, the movement won recognition and legal and social parity in a relatively swift time. But the trans movement, seeming to follow the same contours and sheltered under the same acronym umbrella, differed in a key way. Activists became enthralled with and driven by ideology. Already dubious ideas like social constructivism, the idea that there aren't really discernible differences between men and women, that such differences are socially constructed, and that these artificial differences need to be deconstructed and broken down to achieve equality of outcome, and further gender ideology ideas of non-binarism and fluidity, of devising and imposing upon the vast generality terms like cisgender or male-presenting, and the abstraction of gender from sex, all led to a cultural mess of relativism and inevitable antagonisms in society and governance. The trans community was insisting that its authenticity and legitimacy involved not just its own framing, but that the whole mass who weren't transgender ought to be reframed and contextualized, and ought to have new language imposed upon it. To remove the disadvantage of otherness, this minuscule minority, through its activism, wished to reframe things as a cultural binary, introducing a new term made up in academia. Now there was transgender and cisgender, and a conventional person, rather than simply being of the generality, was now cis or cishet, one side of a coin. The vast generality would also have to adapt and change its understanding of who could use or access what private spaces, a further imposition. And the vast generality, rather than just assuming their gender was innate, had the further imposition of the idea that gender innateness was a negative concept, because it implied a transitioned trans person could not innately be their new gender. The generality had to contend with the further imposed idea that girlhood should no longer be emphasized as a lived and experienced state, with all its travails, ups and downs, and gender-specific formative aspects, separate from their boy peers, because it would deny trans individuals a sense of equally comprehensive experience in their gender. Trans-activism differed from previous multi-generational movements of social liberation because, whereas the feminist movement sought and achieved compromises from men in power relations, roles in the household, and ongoing efforts at parity throughout society, and whereas the civil rights movement sought similar societal parity from whites, the trans community's activism sought the vast generality making compromises in their conception of inherent differences between the genders. And if those among the vast generality didn't cede this ideological ground, they were liable for derision as reactionaries, or worse. Simultaneously, notions of what constituted a woman in terms of anatomy began to collapse into abstraction, both in terms of personal conception and in athletic competition, requiring the further concession from the vast generality that trans athletes with male physiognomy or subsisting musculature ought, by some stringent leveling principle, to be entitled to participate at all levels. The trans movement, invoking social constructivism and trans ideology, sought to deconstruct gender to such an extent that there would be no issue or deterrent, no inherent threshold to cross, no formative or inherent aspects of gender that could inhibit the transition of one person to another gender, with the obvious paradox that gender differences as a state of being should be downplayed or discounted and be no impediment to someone transitioning. But once such a person has transitioned, they are able to revel in their fully realized and natural femininity as a state of being. Soon, people who simply identified as a gender, largely irrespective of physiognomy, found themselves the beneficiaries of protections and civil liberties when it came to communal spaces for women, such as bathrooms and changing rooms, because the denial of such access would be an affront to their identity and rights. Health services had to alter their language, invoking torturous constructions such as chest feeding or people who menstruate. The affirmation of a lot of these ideas seemed for a long time unassailable as part of a wider, oftentimes more sympathetic support for the rights of trans individuals who didn't want to court attention or be conscripted to the front lines of the culture war. Such abstractions of sex and gender, empathy for children wanting to transition, and stringent rights and protections seemed poised to become the prevailing attitude and new cultural norm. Most people were wondering why the Harry Potter lady was being so dogged and undermining her mainstream appeal and reputation. The griping and reactionary efforts to stall this progress seemed mean-spirited, on the wrong side of history, and lacked any support or recognition anywhere in the media. But a correction has gotten underway. Not against trans people per se, but against trans ideology. In 2022, Maya Forstater, a researcher who lost her job at a think tank after tweeting that transgender women could not change their biological sex, successfully brought a test case to establish that gender-critical views are a protected philosophical belief under the Equality Act. She won a landmark decision on appeal. Forstater also successfully won a claim that she was unfairly discriminated against because of her gender-critical beliefs. In January of 2023, the venerable old Atlantic ran a comprehensive piece entitled "Take Detransitioners Seriously." Then came the BBC Tavistock inquiry. The Tavistock Clinic's Gender Identity Development Service for Children, GIDS, shut its doors in 2023 after having prescribed puberty blockers to more than 1,000 children, many under 16, who were questioning their gender identity. In 2009, GIDS saw fewer than 50 children a year. Since then, demand increased 100-fold, with more than 5,000 seeking help in 2021-2022. The clinic became the subject of increasing scrutiny, brought to the fore by a court case in 2020, where complainant Cara Bell accused it of having treated her like an experiment and hastening her into making irreversible changes to her body, and then by the efforts of Hannah Barnes, a BBC journalist, which prompted an investigation into the Tavistock by the NHS regulator. Then there was the attempted boycott of the Hogwarts Legacy video game set in the world of Harry Potter. Activist allies of the trans community would not abide an outspoken critic of trans ideology like J.K. Rowling, benefiting financially and obtaining a proxy recognition, and coordinated to criticize Twitch streamers and reviewers who popularized or affirmed the game. But Hogwarts Legacy was a smash commercial success, and the activists turned out to lack much clout. In mid-2022, World Swimming's governing body, FINA, effectively banned transgender women from competing in women's events. FINA members proposed an open competition category. Trans activists and allies often scoff at the idea of trans athletes being an issue on the grounds of proportionality, that the number are so minuscule that restrictive legislation might apply to a negligible handful of young competitors. But minuscule variations are also a concern of respected sporting veterans and administrators, and many of the general public, who know that, at elite level, competitions, prepared for over years, often come down to 0.1 of a second. And it isn't unreasonable for athletes to take issue with the notion of modern science, medicine, and monitoring of testosterone levels within specific ranges, being able to level the playing field right down to that critical life-changing 0.1 of a second. Then, the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists updated its guidelines regarding transgender care, issuing a statement saying, sex refers to the biological characteristics that define humans as male or female, noting that distress associated with gender may in some situations be related to a range of psychosocial issues or mental health conditions, and emphasizing the importance of psychotherapy and psychosocial support that may provide an opportunity for reflection and exploration. Childhood and adolescence are times of rapid brain development and development of personal identity, and gender-expansive and non-conforming behavior and preferences should not necessarily be a cause for concern or require attention. But trans rights and activism seemed to endure through all of this. Reports would be widely publicized in sympathetic media. A paper in the National Academy of Sciences found that gender identity, the concept of knowing whether oneself is male, female, or non-binary, is as strong in trans kids as it is among those identifying as typical. A Princeton study published in Pediatrics asserted that nearly all transgender kids stick with their new gender identity 5 years later. But the researchers for the National Academy of Sciences report admitted their work had limitations. None of the children studied used non-binary pronouns such as they. The study involved just over 300 children, as did the Princeton study. Many of the subjects were too young for any proper analysis of detransitioning or wish to detransition being especially useful. For physicians, parents, and the public, there was nothing emphatic.
A long-awaited review into NHS gender services for children has warned teenagers are falling off a cliff edge when it comes to care. The CAS Review's final report says children have been let down by a lack of research and evidence on medical interventions in gender care.
Among some of her key findings, questions around how hormones and puberty blockers should be prescribed. She said for most young people, a medical pathway will not be the best way to manage their gender-related distress. She found that despite a considerable amount of published research in this field internationally, the quality was poor. She also said that there was weak evidence regarding the impact of puberty blockers on gender dysphoria, mental or psychosocial health, while the effect on cognitive and psychosexual development remains unknown.
The Cass Report, a sweeping professional investigation headed by Hilary Cass, a retired pediatrician and former president of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, found considerable uncertainty around much of the gender ideology in vogue. The report looked at gender identity services for under 18s in NHS England. It found gender medicine to be operating on, quote, shaky foundations when it came to the evidence for medical treatment like prescribing hormones to pause puberty or to transition to the opposite sex, and the ability of young people to comprehend the scale and implications of their decisions. The findings appeared to refute the model known as gender-affirming care, where a presenting child's gender identity is accepted by clinicians without question. The Cass Review reported that the population of gender dysphoric children had high rates of autism, trauma, and other mental health problems. She also noted that there was a higher rate of same-sex attraction in this clinical population, and acknowledged the social influences on these young people, including online pornography, social media, and peer pressure. In response to the inquiry, the NHS uploaded an official update entitled Implementing Advice from the Cass Review, in which it made a series of commitments. Following full public consultation and engagement, a new evidence-based clinical policy on puberty-suppressing hormones, also called puberty blockers, that makes clear access is no longer routinely available as part of the NHS Children's and Young People's Gender Service. establishing a new National Children and Young People's Gender Dysphoria Research Oversight Board to support the wider research into children's gender services highlighted by your review. All of a sudden, J.K. Rowling was looking to plenty of ordinary folk like she might be right about the gist of the issue. It was permissible to contest much of the trans rhetoric and ideology without coming across as bigoted or socially unacceptable. People are generally accepting of trans individuals who, past the age of 18, transitioned and are living a fully realized life. They might even count one or two such people as friends or co-workers. However, the broad generality will also, despite the prevalence of echo chambers and disillusionment with institutions, still take their cues from institutional bodies headed by professionals with a wealth of experience in their field. The activist wing of transgender ideology has been undermined and shown to be in need of reining in. And this turnaround, empirical, institutional, emphatic, has taken place in just 2 short years. Challenging your long-established beliefs and ideological perspectives can be difficult because it could be seen to undermine your judgment, make you seem inconsistent, or raise the specter of your views being equally vulnerable in the future. In the modern age, consistency is key for branding, audience building, and the algorithm. And when you put all of that together, the idea of evolving your position can seem almost impermissible. But if you're truly liberal, with Enlightenment values of reason and evidence, and contesting ideas, then it's incumbent upon you to change your perspective when academic and institutional findings show an issue in a new light. My own perspective on trans rights, tolerant, affirming, humanist, is no less susceptible to scrutiny, and if I'd relied on the best research and methodologies I could source up till recent times, then there's no shame in me evolving my position, no matter how sincerely held, when more evidence and research has of late reshaped the narrative. It doesn't mean I, or you, were duped or strung along by spurious facts, just that an emerging issue will inevitably accrue more material and evidence. And so, with the emergence of things like the Tavistock Inquiry and the Cass Report, I, and you, can allow a position to change and not feel too compromised, because the commitment to proper inquiry has remained consistent. And that's all that can really be asked of anyone. And if anyone contests that further by saying you should have known all along because your instincts or your common sense or your gut should have told you, that's not really good enough, because throughout history, a liberally empirical approach has, in my view, usually been the better bet over gut instincts. But this idea swings both ways. Most of these venerable institutions still acknowledge the evidence, both scientific and historical, that the spectrum of human gender diversity has long existed in many parts of the world, civilizations, and cultures. They assert further that being trans or gender diverse does not represent a mental health condition. What the trans-activists have managed to achieve is a teasing apart of a whole group of distinctions about sex and gender. In their view, and in the view of many medical and psychological associations, sex refers to the biological characteristics that define humans as female or male, while gender refers to the state of being male, female, or other, while gender identity refers to an individual's personal, internal sense of being in relation to gender, while gender expression is the way a person expresses their gender identity through their behaviors, mannerisms, clothing, hairstyle, voice, or other characteristics. If you find that all confusing, or a bit contrived, or even flaky, and you shake your head incredulously at the neologisms of non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender fluid, and cisgender, no one can blame you. That's the kind of speciousness many activists revel in. But there is another category, distinct from much of that. Gender dysphoria is defined as a marked incongruence between one's experienced or expressed gender and one's assigned gender, associated with clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning. This has less to do with fashion, peer pressure, modern factors, or autism, and is often the condition of individuals who would like nothing more than to correspond to their sex, and will resist dealing with the incongruence for as long as possible, and can even hail from regions and families and communities that are extremely conservative, where there would be every conceivable disincentive to address the issue. Even J.K. Rowling has conceded that there are some instances where gender dysphoria is evident, and may best be resolved through transition once the individual has reached maturity. So, while someone who has remained consistently conservative and resistant to trans-activism, and who even looks upon the modern abstractions of gender, the permissiveness or even encouragement of liberal parents, and the priggish shouting down of guest speakers on college campuses, with exasperation or even contempt, it is also reasonable to ask such people to not entirely or reflexively deride all people who've reached the age of consent and chosen to transition as mistaken or succumbing to a modern social contagion, or a man in a dress, or as mentally ill. Allowing for the idea that select individuals have addressed and resolved an incongruence in their identity will grate against, but won't critically undermine such principles. And if there are a minuscule number of pubescents who, persevering through an array of tests, psychological assessments, delays, enforced periods of reflection, and remain adamant long after 99% of other pubescents have grown out of a phase or been properly diagnosed with a spectrum or social disorder, or conceded there were peer and popular culture influences, or who stubbornly cleaved to the wish to transition because they had committed themselves and felt pressure to see the transition through. When all of that 99% has been filtered out, and 1% of those pubescents remain who begin the process of transition, then you might be open to the possibility of that being a rare, deep-seated incongruence that modern medicine might be able to alleviate. After all, even the Cass report states that while not all trans children will need medical treatment, some will. If that percentage can be reduced down to exceptionally rare cases, abiding by only the most stringent of protocols, with doctors no longer compelled to be supportive as a measure of professional practice, that would likely be acceptable and a sensible correction for the majority of people. The trans movement, with its organized, media-savvy, and enthusiastic activist wing, achieved too much too soon, and we are now seeing a necessary corrective. For all that we've gone through, the antagonisms we've experienced, the culture war skirmishes, and the seemingly intractable differences, there are signs an equilibrium can be reached, one that aligns with the majority's deepest instincts for the welfare of the children.